No, just 5 and probably 6. At least 5 though. And then we'll just postpone 7 until next week. Yeah, I'll move 7's quiz. Alrighty.
So if we don't have everything done by midterm, are you going to alter the midterm?
Yeah, I'll alter the midterm. So we'll still have the midterm at the same time. I'll just alter what's on there. Come on. Okay, cool. So chapter 5. So what was chapter 5 about? So what are the 2 causes of market failures? And how could a market be affected by 2 market failures simultaneously? So let's try Drew.
No idea.
No idea about the market failures? Okay. What about Jacob? The 2 causes of market failures. It'd be helpful if you could see. Anybody? Anybody remember from the reading? Yeah.
Either don't allocate resources like at all to produce a good, or it's under allocated over.
Yes, but the way that the book split it up was into demand side failures and supply side failures. So let's try and think of it in those.
Well, then on demand, it's like it doesn't really reflect like how much a customer should buy, and then the supply is if it doesn't actually show how much.
Right. So the demand side failure is where the demand curve doesn't reflect the full willingness to pay. So it happens when the demand curve doesn't reflect the customer's preferences, right? And then the supply side, just like you said, is when the supply curve doesn't reflect the full cost of producing that good or service. So let's talk about an example of the demand side failure. So we could talk about fireworks. Right? So I can't keep people from watching the fireworks. It's what we would call non-excludable. And the fireworks display can be watched by all, right? So it's non-rival. And so essentially the demand curve for fireworks is going to be much less, it's going to be much lower than the true demand curve, because the true demand curve is factoring in the fact that other people are going to enjoy the fireworks. So there's a greater overall consumer's willingness to pay for the fireworks. Does that kind of make sense? So the other way we could think about is flowers. You know, as I'm walking or biking to school, I see all these flowers. They're pretty, they smell good. They, you know, I get some utility out of the flowers, right? But I didn't pay anything for the flowers. Somebody else went and paid for the flowers, and then there is a positive externality in terms of other people can enjoy the flowers. So the flowers are also non-excludable and non-rival. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now, what about a supply side failure? So the biggest one that we usually talk about is pollution. So this is, you know, probably the most common externality. What do we mean when we say externality? External factor that what? No, so it's when the costs or benefits accrue to someone other than the buyers or sellers. So someone other than the buyers or sellers, we call that a third party, right? And so, yeah, if there's any, you know, harmful chemicals released into the watershed during the production process, but they don't actually pay for, they don't have to pay for it, then the supply curve doesn't reflect that full cost of production.
But if it's dry cleaning with high taxes on dry cleaners because they use so many toxic chemicals, it doesn't count as pollution or externality.
It's still a pollution, but then it's a tax externality, right? And so essentially there's this guy named Pagoo, Alfred Pagoo, and so he came up with what's called a Pagoovian tax. And if the tax is exactly as much as that externality, then like everything should kind of even out. So can both of these occur at the same time? Pardon me.
Wait, both causes of market failure?
Both types of market failure, yeah. And the answer is yes. So for our fireworks example, right, you know, they're going to set off the fireworks because they value them for themselves. They like to charge for the event so that it can be larger than the display that they pay for themselves, but everyone's going to free ride off the display, right? And so there's a demand side market failure in terms of the public good is underprovided. And then if his fireworks displays cause pollution, noise and smoke or potential fire damage, right, then a negative externality may be present as well. Does that make sense? So there's the demand side under allocation essentially, because there's all these people that are going to free ride off of it. They're not going to want to pay to make the display any bigger. And then supply side, because of the pollution, the smoke and the noise and the potential fire hazard, there's going to be an overproduction compared to the true supply curve. All right. So what are the, second question. What are the characteristics of public goods compared to private goods? So contrast the characteristics of public goods versus private goods. Lydia. So not quite, because the next follow-up question is, why don't private firms produce public goods? So it's the nature of the goods rather than the origin of the goods. So what about public goods makes it a public good, and a private good makes it a private good? Right. But what are the characteristics of the private good? Hey, no cheat. So what's going on, guys? Do we have to go to the lecturing? Because we're not coming to class prepared with knowledge. So they're exclusive, very good. So exclusivity.
So which one?
This is the private goods. Sorry, private goods have exclusivity. What does exclusivity means? That means is that once the goods are produced, only one use of them is allowed. Only one use of the goods. And you can exclude others from gaining utility of that use of that good. And then what else? They're rival. And so what does rival mean? So I always like to think about, internet piracy, right? It's non-rival. My use of that song doesn't prevent the consumption of that song by another person, right? So a pizza is rival. A song or a DVD or some computer code is not, right? And so this is one person's consumption prevents consumption by another. So these are the characteristics of private goods. So that means that public goods are non-excludable so once the goods are produced, nobody can be excluded from enjoying the goods benefits. And they are non-rival. So one person's consumption does not prevent consumption by another. So now let's talk about why won't private firms produce public goods?
us an example of public impact?
Yeah, public good, defense, national defense, or roads, right? The fact that, even if you don't pay any taxes as you drive through a bunch of other states, you get to use their roads. Clean air is a public good. We can't exclude anybody from using clean air. My use of clean air doesn't stop you from being able to use clean air. Public water, yes, absolutely. Libraries are a public good. School is a public good. I think. A big one's national defense. But also, air, clean air. We used to, it used to kind of be a joke, but now with what's going on with China and how bad their pollution is and stuff, it's no joke, right? That's what happens when you pull, 1 billion people out of poverty in 20 years and you don't have as much concern for the environment. And, it's like breathing the air in a lot of the cities there is as bad for your health as smoking cigarettes every day. It's really bad. Yes.
Why do you go to national parks? Because you have
Public good.
public, but you have to pay sometimes to
So-
certain things, but it's not.
So it's kind of in the middle. Yeah. So like the Chadron State Park, right? It's not completely public, in terms of it's excludable, right? They charge you a fee. But if it wasn't subsidized by the federal government, it would cost way more. And or those parks would be cannibalized by loggers and developments and things like that, right? And so it's not as much of a public good as something else. Like when you go to Washington, D.C., all the museums are free in D.C. proper. And so those are all like pure public goods. But yeah, the ones where you have to have a parks pass or there's an entry fee or whatever, it's still a public good. There's just, a little bit of exclusivity. And part of the reason why they do that is to raise extra money. But I also think part of the reason is to keep traffic down to those parks because it's going to deter people and people are going to be more likely to go to the completely free park. Or not go or do something else. And so I think part of it is just, foot traffic and how much that degrades the trails and the, nature. Yeah. Private would be a laptop, would be a pizza, would be a coffee, would be, so it's something where I drink the coffee, you can't drink the coffee. And I bought the coffee, so you can't just be like, hey, give me some of that coffee. I guess you can get the good coffee smell. So there's a slight positive externality in terms of my coffee.
But clothing.
Yeah, clothing.
If I buy clothing secondhand,
Right.
would that make it a public good?
No,
or is it
still a private good.
Because I am deriving use from something.
So the definitions of this aren't necessarily the historicity of the clothing. It's more so the characteristic of the clothing. So, I can't just come up to you and be like, hey, give me that jacket. It's your jacket, right? And if you're wearing the jacket, I can't wear it too. And so it's excludable and it's rival. So that's what makes it a private good. Does that make sense?
So in Rapid City Mall, they have a place where you can go in and outfits for an interview if you're
Right.
count as a public good then because it's almost like a library for clothing. It's run by
So it's let's think about it. Is it rival? It's still rival because if somebody uses that pantsuit, then another person can't use it, right? But it's not excludable. And so that's what we call a commons good. So here, there's a nice little chart where we say, is it rival? And is it excludable? And so if it's rival and it's excludable, it's a private good. If it's non-rival and non-excludable, then it's a public good. In that case, the clothing library at Rapid City or whatever, right? because of the fact that those goods are rival, but it's not excludable, it's going to go up here. And these are called commons goods. And so this comes from the day when there used to be a commons in the middle of every field, and we were, you know, it was an agricultural time, and it was kind of before the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was really the start of capitalism and the start of like the first industrial age. The enclosure movement only happened because of technological advances in shearing your sheep. But before that, you could go and you could have your animals graze either on your property or in the commons, right? Now, but what would happen is that everybody would have their animals grazing in the commons more than grazing on their own land. And then eventually the commons would be completely degraded. And so we have a very tropey kind of tale in economics called the tragedy of the commons, right? And so it's the fact that, and we've seen this time and time again with, you know, universities that will buy a bunch of bicycles and say, all right, everybody use the bike. There are bikes, and you don't need to lock them up, and you can just, you know, bike them to wherever you need to go from your dorm or to the place and stop there. And what happens within a few weeks is all the bikes get destroyed or they're stolen or you know what I mean? And so when people don't own things, there's oftentimes a lack of caretaking that goes along with it. And so
what
that
if something's held in common, like say the parish, the church owns this much land and has an orchard on it. Anyone that lives in the parish comes in.
right.
Like
Usually that orchard would get picked over and would like be over. It's like a lake will be overfished. Like if we just let people use it, because of the fact that, you know, market forces will incentivize people to, you know, just profit seek, right? So they're going to overfish that lake, and in the end, they're going to degrade the quality of that lake forevermore. And that's kind of what we're seeing with the planet, in a way, right? Is that, you know, we like the planet is a common resource that everybody has been using, you know, polluting the air, polluting the water, using all the fossil fuels and stuff, right? And so we're seeing a tragedy of commons on a global scale.
what's the last one?
The last box is a club good. So a country club, right? You know, my presence at a country club doesn't detract from somebody else's presence at a country club, but I can only get in there if I pass the exclusivity test or I pay them money or whatever. I know the right people. It's club good. Like that, and honestly, the only time that I ever really want a club good is when I'm traveling on an airplane. And I want in those lounges, the special Delta lounge, and I want in. I don't know why. That's a club good, right? Any questions on our types of goods? All right, moving on. Okay, so let's draw a production possibility curve. And we're going to have public goods on that axis, and we're going to have private goods. And remember that our PPC is always bowed out a little bit. And really quickly, let's just talk about some different points on the PPC. What's going on at point A? Brock. A lot of zeros going in the participation book today, people. It's the only way. Otherwise, we'll have to go back to lecture. And you think this is boring now? Lecture's way worse. All right, anybody else? Anybody want to try and redeem themselves from earlier? What's going on at point A? Andrew.
Underproduction?
Yes, underutilization. Good enough. I'll take it. We are not using all of the resources in the economy efficiently. What about at point B? What's going on at point B? Yes, so this is unfeasible. That's not literally just with the current technology, with the current amount of resources, right? We can't produce that many both public and private goods at the same time. What about point C? What do we call it when we're at point C? No, that's where two curves meet. The supply and demand curves meet. Huh? Efficient! Yay! Good job. That's an efficient use, right? Very good. And we are asked, how might the output of public goods be increased if the economy is initially operating at a point inside the curve? So if we're initially operating at A, and we want to increase the public good production, we would just move to literally any point on this curve that's above C, right? Any of these points compared to A would increase the amount of public good utilization. Does that make sense, everybody? So what happens if a plague wipes through my country and wipes out half the people? What happens at the PPC? Towards the origin. Very good. It shrinks. Plague. All right. What about if aliens come and they share all their secrets of technology and resources with us? What happens to the PPC then? Shift outwards. Very good. New technology / resources.
So if they find a new way to make plastic out of hemp.
Boom. That's going to shift the PPC up. Yep. All right. I've got some questions for you guys, and we should just go down the list here. Andrew, what kind of good is French fries? Should it be the market system or the government?
Market.
Market system, very good. All right, what about airport screening, Kayla? Airport screening, what kind of good is that? Kayla here? Okay. Can't shove them in here a lot. Lydia, what markets, airport screening? Government, and why? Right, but what about the good? Is it non-rival or rival? Airport screening. Non-rival. And is it non-excludable? Non-excludable. That's why we keep it in the government. Awesome. Okay, Drew. What about court system? Government. Why?
Legal system is non-rival deal. Constitutionalized instead.
And is it excludable? No, not excludable. Right, doesn't matter. You can't just opt out. All right. Mail delivery system. Wait. Public, right? As long as the law gives the Postal Service a monopoly. But you know, with package delivery, obviously they have private competition. All right. think already kind of did that work. All right, I think we should move on from chapter 5. I'm not going to test you too heavily on this material. Well, actually, let's talk about taxes. That's probably new to a lot of you. So what is meant by a progressive tax? Right, so the average rate increases as your income increases. So as your income increases, you pay a larger proportion of your income to the government. What is a regressive tax? That's one where the average rate decreases as your income increases. And then right in the middle, you guessed it, a proportional tax or a flat tax is one whose average rate remains the same regardless of income.
Mr. McCarthy,
So,
can you give an example of a regressive tax?
of a regressive tax, sales tax. So even though the percent of sales tax on your sales, so even though it's 7% for everybody, whether you're rich or poor people spend like 80, 90% of their income every month. And so most of their income is getting taxed by income tax and by the sales tax, whereas wealthier people might spend 10 or 15% of their income on stuff. And so the same, does that make sense? So the same amount of sales tax is less of a percentage of their total income. That's why like the proposals for a flat sales tax is actually a regressive tax, not really a proportional tax, even though it has the name of a flat tax, right? Because you have to look at what people spend their money on.
So because it's one proportionate, not really the rate itself.
Exactly. Exactly. And the fact that a lot of our income gets double taxed. Gets taxed when we get it, gets taxed when we spend it. So let's talk about different kinds of taxes. So what about the federal personal income tax? We think that that's progressive, regressive, or proportional.
Progressive.
So let's take a look real quick. Stop it. Why are you so loud? Oh my gosh. Let me use the internet. So here is the legit information. So if you make up to $10,000, you get 10% of that first $10,000 tax. Then the 10,000 to 38,000, you get 12% of that tax. Then for the $38,702 to your $82,500, you get taxed at 22%, jumps up 10%. And then it jumps up even more and even more.
Is that or it's right on?
Let's see. Federal poverty level. 25,000 for a household of 4. So a household of 1 is only like 12,000 or something. So yeah, I mean,
That explains why.
the break is after that.
Yeah.
That explains, but yeah, I mean, in terms of why, there's a lot of historical movement, there's a lot of inertia to these things, right? In terms of like, they are the way they are because they were the way they were. And it's really hard to raise taxes, right? It's easy to lower taxes. Everybody wants that. And then it's hard to raise taxes, which is part of the reason why, you know, our federal deficit is so high and our national debt is just, you know, growing and growing and growing, because we're not taking in near enough tax revenue for what we outlay every year. Yeah, Andrew.
Does head of household, like, is that including like all household income?
Yeah,
Or so that why it separates a little bit from single, like the first 2 brackets?
exactly. So head of household is like you're living at home with a kid or with an elderly adult that you're taking care of, right? So I'm not head of household because I just live by myself. But if I lived with somebody that was a dependent, then I would be head of household. But these rates weren't always like this, right? You know, so real quick, historical tax rates in the like 1970s or something. They got really wild and crazy for a while. Oh, we don't want to be reading this crap. No, we want to look at a chart.
Have you heard about like the widow's tax or widow's?
I have not.
Okay, so basically what happens is the federal government has like a pension for the widows of soldiers that died in action. And then they also can pay into a life insurance plan that the federal government pays out as a pension. But the current plan was that every dollar that comes out of the life insurance plan is like a dollar that you can't get pension. So what they would do is they put the life insurance plan in their child's name.
Right.
But then the new tax laws made it so that that money gets taxed as inheritance coming their kid.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's like a real big issue that I've been hearing about on NPR a lot.
Yeah. No, I could see that being, because, you know, essentially like you had, you know, the kids' college / you know, trust fund set up, and now there's not as much money as there was before. So here's the historical rates, and as we can see, you know, they were all very high during, you know, war period, right? And they fell. You know, this is 45. This is when peace was declared, and then they were, you know, they were raised back, not quite to the level of the war, but they were still raised back up in the early 50s. Then they were lowered. Then they kind of hit another slump. Then during the 1980s, got to the point where anything over $500,000. So if you made $2 million, 50% of that last $1.5 million was taxed. So they took half of it. Now, I mean, to be devil's advocate, what do you need that much money for? You know, it's so much money, especially in 1980. You know, like $2 million 1980. Like, what was that? $2 million 1980 dollars to today. This says $1 million, purchasing power of $3 million. So it's 3 times the amount of money now. So it's $6 million now, right? Yeah. So, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. Go away. I just wanted to show you guys that these things are all very, what did I do? that these things are very historical. They change over time. We have been experiencing a long period of low taxes, and part of the reason for that is because right here, 1973, this is when we stopped redeeming US dollars with gold to central banks. So we stopped redeeming US dollars with gold with citizens in 1935, but we were still redeeming it for foreign central banks, right? So the central bank of France or the central bank of England, they'd have all these dollars from, selling stuff to us or whatever, right? They'd have all these dollars saved up. And instead of just exchanging the dollars for their own currency, they would want gold for those dollars. And we would put a bunch of gold on a barge and ship the barge across the Atlantic into their country, right? So we stopped doing that in 1973, partly because if we continued to do it, we were going to run out of all the gold that we had. So we stopped doing it. Richard Nixon suspended the gold window in 1973. And since then, we've been on what's called the floating dollar standard. So everybody uses the dollar to denominate, their assets and their long-term debt and trade contracts and all sorts of stuff like that, right? And as a result of that, we essentially print the world money. So we have not had the same accountability as any other nation in the world since 1973, which is part of why our tax rates have plummeted and they've stayed really low. And there's no incentive to raise them back up. Yes?
Do you think that this might be a good argument? Is a spending problem?
I think it's both. I mean, I think the answer is both. I think we're not taxing enough. I think there's too many loopholes. And I also think that the amount of money that we spend, especially on the military, is absurd. We can't audit the military. The Pentagon is too large and too labyrinthian for us to actually figure out where any of the money's actually going. It's a mess. So I think it's both. I think it's a problem of both. Yes, very much so. If the U.S. dollar crashed, most of the rest of the world would undergo a recession. Some of the developing countries would undergo a depression just because of that.
Did they see that in the 1930s? Or was that
No.
before the U.S.?
So England was, the power, right? They used to say, the sun never sets on England because England had so many territories and colonies all throughout the world that literally, like when it was dark on one side of the world, there was it was daylight at some point in England. So England really ruled with their pound sterling and that being both. At one point, they had it pegged both to gold and to silver. They had this bimetallic standard. Then World War I essentially bankrupted England, and they were just like, well, we don't want to be the banker of the world anymore, such we can't be the banker of the world. So we had an interwar period in the 1930s where there wasn't really anybody at the helm of the international monetary system, which, as you can understand, created a lot of friction. So, international trade and international investment was much more difficult and riskier in that period as a result. Exactly. Well, and there was also just no kind of common denominator to make all the trades in, right? And a lot of scholars believe that the kind of monetary chaos that was happening in that interwar period, coupled with the large debts that Germany owed because of World War I, was a large contributor to the hyperinflation. Germany tried to essentially print its way out of debt. And so then they had crazy hyperinflation in their country. And they devalued their currency so much that they couldn't really get out of debt. And that's part of what started the nationalist movement and the Nazis and the start of World War II was because of the fact that the British or the Germans were so behind. They were in such arrears about what they owed, specifically what they owed to the British. And why was Britain hounding Germany to pay them back so much?
Because they
Because they were broke. Why were they broke?
Just all their money in the war.
They spent all their money on guns in the war. Who'd they buy all those guns from? The USA. We were the largest war profiteers of that First World War, and us hounding Britain for the money that they owed us, a lot of scholars believe is part of the reason why Britain was hounding Germany and why Germany, tried to spend their way out of their debt and hyperinflated their currency and started the rise of Hitler's power. Pretty crazy. So all this to say that the tax rate, the personal income tax rate, great rant, is slightly progressive. So we would call this mildly progressive. And so why mildly? Because of loopholes. So there's just a lot of different loopholes. We saw a lot of loopholes for LLCs with pass-through real estate income that came through with the latest tax regulation, tax rewrite. So a lot of people saw advantages from that. What about 4% general sales tax? So I already told you about this, so you already know. 4% general sales tax. This is regressive. Why? The poor spend all their income mostly on commodities that are subject to sales tax. Then what about a municipal property tax on real estate? I know we're getting into that really interesting stuff. Municipal property tax on real estate. So this could be, so in terms of where the incidence could fall on, it could fall on the owners of the land. It could fall on the tenants if rented. Or it could fall on the consumers if the property is used in the business. So in the case of 1 and 2, we would think that it's a proportional tax. Why? Because it's based on the value of the property. The lower one's income, the lower the value of property one owns, right? What about if it's applied If it's the incidence falls on the consumers, what kind of tax do we think it'd be then?
Progressive.
Very good. Why?
Because the same way that sales tax works.
Yep.
I don't know.
Very good. Any other questions on chapter 5?
So when you talk about like aggressive, is it because poor people are spending more money on things that are being taxed, or is it because paying for that tax is a bigger part of their like?
Yes, both. Both, yeah. One of those ties into the other, yes. All right. Chapter 6, businesses and their costs. All right, so what's a plant? What's a firm? What's an industry?
Plant is a factory, stores or mine. But multiple functions.
It's where production takes place. What's a firm? Business organization that owns one or more plants.
Why would a store be classified as a plant though? The
So
store
it
is
wouldn't.
just a-
It wouldn't. Yeah, factory, mine. That's probably good. Just anywhere. Well, hold on. Retailing. No, it could be retailing, wholesaling, warehousing. So yeah, that's fine. Retailing.
Let's say, but what about like a Krispy Kreme? They make the donuts in-house.
Exactly. So wholesaling, warehousing. Anything necessary for production and distribution. An industry. If it stood independent, then the plant and the firm would be the same thing, according to this definition. Does that make sense? So yeah, you like you could have a plant and a firm be the same building and group of people and stuff like that. But right, yeah, because the firm is like the entity that owns the plant. Does that make sense? So you can think about the firm as more like the business formation, and the plant is one of the locations. And so usually at first they start off as one and the same. The plant and the firm are the same people, place, and thing. But then, you know, like New Belgium Brewery, then they expanded and they opened a plant in South Carolina, right? But there's still one firm called New Belgium Brewery, but now there's two plants instead of one. Make sense? And they're part of the craft brewing industry. And then the last one is a vertically integrated firm. So this contains plants involved in various stages of the production process. So if a brewery also owns a farm where they grow the hops. We also have horizontally integrated firms. And this contains plants involved in the same function of business. So who here knows horizontally integrated firm? Who's paying attention when they're buying their soap and their toothpaste? Yeah, very good. P&G, Procter and Gamble, right? Procter and Gamble, they own like Unilever, they own Head and Shoulders, they own Dove, they own Old Spice. I mean, it's like, yeah, yeah. It's a bunch of the consumer staples that we buy are they're process. They have a brand name that's targeted to us, you know, whether it's male or female or whatever segment of the population we are. But it's all pretty much the same crap, just scented, pushed out by Procter and Gamble and one other firm, I think. Can't even remember though, because they're so huge. They have like so much of the market share. So that's horizontally integrated. The same thing with sodas, right? You got Coke and Pepsi, but they've got all those different brands. Except for Dr. Pepper. Dr. Pepper is a loner. But then Dr. Pepper sells, well, they sell the Sprite, who's in the Pepsi family, right? No. Yeah, because Mr. Pibb is in the Coke family.
But I think you can get Dr. Pepper at Coke.
Really? Mr. Pibb's dead. I like Mr. Pibb a little better. I know they taste exactly the same. I think I just like the branding better. It was kind of interesting that there was a Mr. and a Doctor, and they both tasted like the same damn soda. Strange. Anyways, questions on these types of firms? Okay. Last one is a conglomerate. And that's a firm that has plants producing in several industries. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Very good.
Okay, so
Uh, like, trying to think. Plants producing several. I mean, P&G is a conglomerate because they're not just in the healthcare. They produce lighters. They produce other stuff like that, right? So they're in several industries.
so we would almost put like Unilever as horizontally integrated firm and then Procter.
No, Procter & Gamble would be both of them. Yeah, would be both. I'm just trying to think of other conglomerates. I mean, in a way, Walmart is a conglomerate because not only are they a retailer, but they're, a supply chain. Like that's why Walmart got so big, is because of how they deal with their supply chains and warehousing and everything like that. Like it's something crazy. Like every product in Walmart changes like shelf or like gets replaced every like 60 days. Like they're super tight on their inventory. It's crazy. So they don't have a lot of stuff rotting, and they don't have a lot of stuff like going out of style, right? Like they keep everything fresh. I'm trying to think of other conglomerates. I mean, Microsoft, but not really. That's just trying to think of companies that span different industries. Yeah, they own a great. So yeah, so they're also producing food and producing, yeah, and their home goods brand or whatever, home value something, yeah. But they also have Sam's Club and they have Walmart, yeah. Yeah, because they're doing hardware and they're doing software. Yeah, yeah. So I would say, yeah, they're dipping into conglomerate status. Now, a lot of these things aren't like cut or dry, right? They kind of like bleed into each other. Like everything's kind of a Venn diagram on top of each other. So
like the oil industry and the plastic, because oil.
But is there like one giant company that's DuPont. DuPont is a conglomerate in that industry. General Electric. Yeah, they've got their hands in everything, right? Okay. Moving on. What is the principal agent problem? Who hasn't talked yet today? What is the principal agent problem? And how does it relate to corporate managers and stockholders? Is it the fact that I should make so I think what I'll do is I'm going to move chapter 7. What time is it? 3:05, 10 minutes. We don't have enough time to really get through chapter 6. So I'm going to move chapter 6 and chapter 7. Quiz is over, right? But then I'm going to assign you, how about we just get, who's done the chapter 5 and 6 Learn Smarts already? Okay. So that's, yeah. So I'm gonna start front loading Learn Smarts. So you guys will have 7 and 8 as well this week. So that way you come to class on Tuesday and you already know what's going on in chapter 7 and 8. Does that make sense? So there'll be less quizzes, but there'll be more Learn Smarts this week. And then I'm just gonna edit everything. So like you'll have the Learn Smarts due ahead of the week, right? And then we'll do the week and we'll have these sessions. And then you'll have the quiz for that week, and then new Learn Smarts for the next week. Does that make sense?
Okay. And then I'd also do it 10 p.m.
I gotta switch that. No, they're all supposed to be due at midnight. It's the fact that the course was set up in Eastern Standard Time, and then I switched it to Mountain Time, but it kept all things. So I'm gonna do that this afternoon. It's like a half hour, really boring work I've been putting on.
So this week, 5, 6, 7, and 8 Learn Smarts are due, but then
Yes.
But then chapter
5 and
5,
6.
6, 7, 8 tests on due.
Well, no, so just 4 and 5 are due. I'll make an announcement too to clarify. So just 4 and 5 will be due. And then next week will be 6, 7, 8. And then the weeks after that, well, next week's also midterm week, right? So I don't think we're going to have I don't think we have assignments due on that week.
According to.
We do? Okay, awesome. So we'll keep that then, and then, so then it'll just, and then we'll be caught up and it'll just be 2 quizzes, 2 Learn Smarts every week, but it'll be the next 2 Learn Smarts and the 2 quizzes that are about the chapters we went over that week. Does that make sense?
Are the Learn Smarts going to be on Sunday or is it?
They'll be due Sunday. Yeah, they'll be due Sunday. So everything, we'll just keep everything due on Sunday. Okay?
Opening 8 this week.
Yes. Yes. So you'll have all the way through 8 for Learn Smarts. And again, I'll post an announcement this afternoon. Sorry to make it confusing. But yeah, I just want to make sure you guys are reading the materials before we come into class, so then I don't have to do as much lecture-y stuff, right? Because we can all read, we can all memorize stuff, we can all learn definitions. I want to come in here and talk about the, you know, the nitty-gritty parts of stuff. Wait, we're not done. Still got like 7 minutes. I'm just talking. So what about the principal agent problem? Does anybody remember the principal agent problem?
I remember reading that term, but I don't remember what it is.
It's a conflict of interest.
We have executives that are enjoying like excessive perks, like private jets and all that kind of stuff. And so it's like using money from the company so they don't maximize the profit. So then you have like a conflict between.
So that's what happened. That was the backfire. That's not the intention. So the problem is, so the principal agent problem is the fact that the managers, the corporate managers have different interests or incentives, right? From the shareholders. So what are these different interests, right? Well, so the manager, he wants, you know, high pay, extensive fringe benefits, posh working conditions. I don't think I've ever written posh in my life. And what does the shareholder want? Yeah, return on his profits. Wants profits and share prices go through the roof. And so what was the solution? Starting in the 1990s, the firms issued stock to the executives as part of their compensation. Trying to align the interests of the 2 groups, right? But it backfired because it gave executives the incentive to inflate the stock price. Then sell before anyone noticed.
How would they inflate the stock price?
They would use fraudulent accounting practices.
So make it look like the company was doing really good, so people would.
To overstate the profits. And so what happened was, you know, they would usually leave, they'd sell their stock. The executives have these huge windfalls, and then, you know, the average corporate employee that might have been paying into the pension forever is left with nothing.
And then 2008.
So yeah, so 2008 happened because, I mean, so a lot of it was because of the ninja loans, right? So 2008, mortgage lenders were issuing ninja loans. What is a ninja loan? No income, no job application. So essentially, rubber stamping. Do we all know what that means? Rubber stamping is when you don't actually consider something and you're just saying, yep, approve, 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 right? So rubber stamping the loans, and in some cases, robo approving mortgages that shouldn't have been approved. Just so they can get paid. And so that was a large, what's it called, principal agent problem that we saw in 2008. Yep.
So, like, what do you mean robo approving?
Like a person didn't actually look at it. Like it just automatically approved it. So like there was a big scandal. I think it was like Countrywide, but I think also Wells Fargo or something like that. And it was like, so people were getting their houses back because they were, oh, sorry. So I think I got that confused with the foreclosures. When they were doing all the foreclosures, they weren't like you're supposed to have a lending agent that like looks at it and signs it. And they were just having the robot just go through and just close them all. Like, so it was just shady business practices. They weren't looking at things and doing the proper due diligence, looking at the people's financials, looking at their assets, looking at their income. They were just selling these houses to people that had no right to be in the house. And they knew, or they didn't care to think. But if they would have thought, then they would have known that like they're selling these people variable adjusted rate mortgages, right? And so, yeah, the people, they can afford it right now when the interest rates are nothing, but as soon as the interest rates go up, they can't afford the house anymore. And they haven't put enough equity into the house. And so now they're underwater. And so a lot of people that, you know, do you guys know what I mean when I say underwater? That means that the value of your house is lower than what you owe on it. Yeah, the value of the house is lower than what you owe on it. And so there's no, it's going to cost you money to sell the house. And so that ended up happening to a lot of people, partly because the interest rate skyrocketed on these adjusted interest rate mortgages, but also because of the whole, you know, you have equity in your house, do a reverse mortgage and get the equity out of your house to fix up your house, and then and then appraise it for more money, and then you can pull more money out of it, and you know what I mean? So there was a lot of people that were just kind of like scamming that process to pull equity out of their house, thinking that, you know, everything's going to be fine. And then when the economy collapsed and their stock portfolio collapsed and they lost their job, then all of a sudden the fact that they had shelled all the equity out of their house really ended up screwing them financially. And we're seeing that again right now. We're seeing all sorts of, you know, subprime mortgages, and we're seeing, you know, commercials for reverse mortgages and pulling the equity out of your house. You know what I mean? Like, we're seeing the same kind of of predatory behavior that we saw in 2008. Part of the reason for that is because a lot of the protections that we had were, they've been rolled back.
Wasn't there legislation?
There was a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that Elizabeth Warren was the head of. That's like where she got her start in politics, but that's been essentially shelled out. It's a husk of what it was. All right, guys, do the Learn Smarts. I'll send an announcement, just clarifying everything, and have a great weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday.